listening to all these, I'll just start out by saying this Kala and Desha is a very important concept in Indian tradition. So it's going to be very important in understanding Pollock also. When he is saying something and who he is saying to. That is going to be fairly important. That will come across, I think. It has come across in several presentations. That will be coming in my presentation also. So, starting 2008, Pollock is going to be writing several articles which are of philological nature, addressing some of his theories and also some other issues that is going on in American academia. So first work here is towards the political philology, D.D. Kosambi and Sanskrit 2008. And this here itself we can see he is going to give out, he is going to state his major thesis, and this is what he is going to be working towards. Philology has political projects and political lessons to teach. We can actively make our future only because we know who we are and where we have come from. So this is going to be, I think, the highest goal. What I would say is Paramartha of Sheldon Pollock. And what I call knowledge politics is a word he uses several places. But what I call the practice of knowledge politics. Practice means not just a theory of knowledge politics. He's going to be actively practicing it. So there are several other works in 2009, Future Philology, the Fate of a Soft Science in a Hard World. Of course, what is happening, there is something else, lot of undercurrents are there which we are not aware of. One thing that is happening in American academia is that over the last several decades, this humanities is losing lot of ground, it is losing its importance, and philology is essentially dying or dead. So he wants to save philology. So he is responding to that partly, and also partly giving some of his theories also. There is one more commentary on Epicycles of ఖ్యాతి. This is a work by the sinologist Christopher Deppy, who has written a book called Cycles of ఖ్యాతి. And in reviewing this work, he gives some few things that few of his theories or opinions on philology. These are all fairly short articles. Critical philology is very important. That gives in a very few pages just essence of his theories. Liberating philology, again, it's about this American academia that is going on. And it's not quite clear why he uses this term, liberating. He uses critical philology, political philology is okay. But suddenly this liberation term, I didn't understand. Of course, it is Rajiji has mentioned in battle. But from within the works itself, it is not quite clear why he is using this. Philology in 3 dimensions is same as critical philology. Just to repeat that. And Philology Rediviva, Philology Reborn, which is written in 2015. Again, very small article about the status of philology in American academia. And then there is a very interesting conference that is held in 2008 and 2010 in Taiwan and in mainland China. And that is about global trends, global traditions in philology, it is called. And the proceedings are published in 2015. So he is writing the introduction, and he is also going to be writing the lead article, What was Philology in Sanskrit? That is in 2015. And there is supposedly a liberation philology book that is to be published. And there was also one more work called Indian Philology and India's Philology, which was published in some journal, some French journal, I think, which I didn't have access to. But I think this was sufficient to get an idea of what his theories are. And it was a little disappointing because I started, I'll tell why I chose this topic later on. A little disappointing because there was not much theory actually. I was expecting a lot of knowing Pollock and language of gods and all these things we've been discussing. Quite him go into very serious detail and give a lot of details, theories, but there was not much about, there was not much theorizing. So whatever he has done, I'll just present it. So philology, he says, what is philology? Philology is making, general definition, philology is making sense of text. And the question comes, is oral tradition included in this? Generally, as far as Indian tradition, he always only refers to written texts. He doesn't talk about oral traditions at all. But he is writing some of these philological works, is meant for some American academia. So he's always oral tradition, he says a textual tradition, oral tradition, also electronic text also should be included, he says. At least 3 places he says this. But that is for American academia. So in case of Indian tradition, as far as I know, he doesn't say anything about oral traditions. And he's always thinking on a very large scale, very large scale. He never sees himself as somebody sitting in an office and editing, having manuscripts and editing, taking all these Patavedas and editing books. He doesn't see himself as an academic philologian. He's always talking about this thinking of text trans-historically and trans-culturally over a period of 1,000 years. So he's not an academic philologist, but more, as he says, one who is striving to live life philologically in a very, very global scale, very civilizational scale, we can say, very large sense. And then he says interpretation, this is the essence of philology. Interpretation is the essence of philology, he says. We'll come back to this interpretation. And this history of philology is quite interesting. 1800 seems to be a very interesting date. And this is one of my most interesting things I discovered while I was studying. So just to do a background reading, I refer to some of these earlier philologists, such as Sheldon and other German scholars. And they seem to be, I just referred, I didn't go deeply, but whatever I referred to, they seem to be saying something very significant has happened in 1800. Before 1800, philology means just love of language or love of books. That's all it means. But by 1800, it becomes something very significant. And the only thing that is significant that is happening in 1800 is Europe is being introduced to this Indian knowledge system that is going on. So that is somehow, that I have not heard, this is the first time I am seeing this also, that is somehow completely revolutionized European thought from what the early Germans are saying. At least till Nietzsche. Nietzsche seems to be saying something extremely significant that has never happened. Some extremely significant something has happened in 1800 that has never happened before, since the Greco-Roman times. And they've had this contact with Arabs also. So that has not happened when they've had contact with Arabs. But 1800 he says something significant. And 1800 is when we are being in a large scale. Of course, they've had contact with India much before that. 1800 is very, where this large amount of texts are being taken and transferred and studied and things like that. And something, this will come back to this also. But what is happening there also, and then later on there is a lot of this silence that is there. We don't hear about this date later on, and this is mentioned in Battle also. And there is this great silence where West does not acknowledge this kind of contribution, India's contribution to the development of Western humanities. And if it is acknowledged, it is in a very, very insignificant sense. Even I think 2014, James Turner publishes a book on history of philology. There is one chapter that says about Indian philology, India's contribution, but that is it's not. It is as if it is of not much significance. He's talking about philology from Greco-Roman times to modern times, and maybe little insignificant contribution by Indians. But that is not what the early Germans are saying. Early Germans are saying something significant has happened in 1800. So this is important for Pollock. I'll come back to this because Pollock is going to say something about this. So what is philology? Philology is, he talks about philology, understanding text in 3 dimensions. It's historical, traditional and presentist. Historical, its moment of genesis, the text's moment of genesis. Tradition means the tradition of reception, and presentist means its own presence towards objectivity, how we feel towards the text. And he says all these meanings, the historist, the commentarial traditionalist, and the pessimist, and the presentist are all true. So all meanings are true, he generally says. So first dimension is called historical, or he calls it the scientific also. And this is what normal historical approach we take. So we look at the author, we look at the text, when was it composed, we look at some internal evidences, we look at external evidences, what the text is saying about itself. And this is essentially the historical reading of the text. And he says most early Indologists had this approach. So when they study about Rig Veda, they take this historical approach. And this second is going to be Pollock's contribution, which is a tradition or pragmatic. So everywhere he's going to be saying what the tradition, he's not giving the subjective meaning, but he's going to be saying what the tradition, what the Indians are saying about themselves. Starting in 1985 with the Shastra paper, you'll see this pattern. This has not been, it's been ignored by Indologists. This Indians' own sense of their literary world was ignored. and then not seen by the tradition also. So he gives this example of Prashasti, and Prashasti is, for example, not analyzed in Alankara Shastra. So it's not being seen by the tradition. These inscriptions are also not analyzed by the tradition. So this is where it's going to be his contribution. He says the Indologists have not seen this. The tradition also does not talk about this. And then why does the tradition not talk about this? He says no culture has a complete understanding of itself. So culture cannot understand itself. So he is going to come and tell us. So this is the tradition. He is going to give us the traditional meaning. But then he himself gives an objection. He says you're going to give the traditional meaning, what the tradition is saying about itself. But then you're using this Western methods. He himself is criticizing me, asking a question. So he says, he gives this analogy of in India where there is no, strictly speaking, there is no history books in India as you speak history as written in modern times. There are no history books that are there, but still history is there in India. And so therefore something may not be there. So it is history books may not be there. History will be there, and that doesn't mean we cannot talk about history or write history books. So that he gives that analogy to say that even though I'm going to be representing, I'm going to be telling you what tradition says. Even though that these methods are Western methods, this is okay because it needs to be said. So even you don't have to criticize me saying that I'm using Western methods. Since it was not there, he says historicism involved is a sort that ancient or medieval traditions never practiced. So they didn't have this, so we can use these methods to tell, to understand tradition, what tradition is saying about itself. So this is going to be his contribution. It is not something not seen, and he's going to be showing us what it is. So everywhere it will be this unseenness will be there in all his works post 1985. So that is why I think Ramayana is much earlier. Ramayana does not fit this paradigm. So it is not something unseen that is becoming seen. So I think the translation is done. In the preface he writes late 70s it is done, and published much later on. 84 it is published. But starting 1985 this pattern is going to come. And of course the present and the subjective kind of meaning. So what does the text mean to me? And of course what does it mean to Pollock? It's always this practice of knowledge politics. He's going to be looking at text with this political lens everywhere. So he gives an example here. So Ramayana in the first dimension, this is historical. So he says it has an obscure moment of genesis. We don't know when it was written. It belongs to the thought world of post-Ashokan India, and it is influenced by Ashoka's political theology. So Ramayana in the second division, which is what is going to be Pollock's contribution. So he says, according to tradition commentators, it had a scriptural meaning. The poem is about God's deed on earth, meaning Rama's avatara. And the question is, what happens to the political aspect? So here he is defining the text. It was influenced by Ashoka's political theology. So it has a political aspect, not just a theological text. It has a political aspect to it. But here what happens, when we look at the commentators and all the literature that is there on Ramayana, there is no question of any politics there. There is no, Govindaraja is not talking about politics. Govindaraja is not talking about politics, he's only talking about religion and avatar and all these things. So the political aspect is not there. That is what Pollock is going to come and tell us. It is there. And Ramayana, the third dimension, this is how he sees it. Ancient text has been repurposed as an anti-Muslim text, brought the nation to the brink of civil war, which I didn't know actually. I just linking all these years I didn't know. In 1993 years. Linking this to the historical dimension. So he's saying this, he'll say this text caused this kind of commotion, this kind of anti-Muslim, it's anti-Muslim text, and it has caused this kind of civil war, whatever. So there must be something in the text itself that is doing this. It is not something that is external to the text, it is going to be internal to the text. So therefore he'll go back and say, he'll go to the first dimension and say, okay, this is, the politics is there in the text itself. So they're all sort of connected to each other. So this is, okay, this is, so where is the political aspect? So all the commentators are not talking about politics. There's nothing, no Ramacharita-manas, Kamba Ramayanas, there's nothing about politics there. So this is where he's going to say, of course Indologists have not seen this. The tradition cannot see this also because no tradition can understand about itself. Now I'm going to come and tell you this political aspect. So we'll come back to this also. And this is going to be very important. How is going to be interpreted? He says interpretation is the essential aspect of philology. The meanings on all three planes are true, and there is no need to reconcile or rank them. So they can be, you can say something on the historical plane, it can be something different on the second plane, and something completely different on the third plane. It doesn't matter if they are diametrically opposed to each other. You don't have to reconcile them, or one is not going to be more true than the other. And this is because we are living in this kind of pluralistic universalism. We are living in a world that is very plural. So we have to accept all these different viewpoints, and we have to move away from this Platonic monism. So Plato was talking about this one kind of interpretation. We have to sort of go away from this interpretation. And he gives the example of Rumi and the 73 sects. He says Rumi associated himself with all the 73 sects of Islam. And somebody came and criticized him, how can he do this? And he said that his reply was, I accept your interpretation also. So it's coming across as being very, very liberal, extremely liberal. I think you can't, it's going to be difficult, when you read this text, it's going to be difficult. I think Madhu Kishwar was saying you can file some kind of defamation. It's not going to be so easy because several places he's talking about being very humanistic and accepting other people's view and things like that, as far as interpretations are concerned.
As requested, 15 minutes is over.
Okay. So some viewed tradition interpretation as a history of error. So he says in this second level also, there can be no such thing as an incorrect meaning. I'll just move on a little faster. So he's got important points of this interpretation is that all interpretations are true. There's no question of incorrect meaning. And he also says that contradictions are okay when you're trying to understand some big power structures. That is one important point. And truths can be based, as truths are based on truths can also be based on false also. So these 4 important points he's giving. And essentially saying you can say whatever you want. That is his theory. Interpretations, all interpretations are true. What is the second one? There is no such thing as incorrect interpretation. Contradictions are okay as long as you're trying to understand bigger structures. And truths can be based on false, just as truths can be based on truths also. So now this means the people, followers of his school of thought are going to be quite confident, and they're going to be thinking, they're going to be saying that if we just state our position, it is sufficient, and we don't have to even have a debate. But they're also going to be thinking it's very humane and very inclusive, and they're not going to be changing their position. That is a very important point. They will not, whatever we say, the Purva Paksha is not going to change their position because it is very, he has said all interpretations are okay. So this is one thing, important thing I wanted to say here. This is the most important thing I wanted to say, conclusion, not conclusion. Taking what I have seen and what all the presentators have seen and taking the defense he is giving. The defense he is giving is that all interpretations are okay. There can be different meanings. There can be no such thing as incorrect meaning. And these contradictions are okay. By saying these things, essentially he's accepting that there are a lot of weaknesses in his paper. So what I'm going to be saying, putting both this together and saying, in the Vyavaharika or the evidential level, the truthness or the correctness is not going to be important for Pollock. When I say Vyavaharika, I'm just saying in the general sense, not in the technical sense. So whatever Pollock writes, essentially, maybe after 1985, whether it is true or false, it is not important for him. It can be true, it can be false. But how it is perceived is going to be much more important for him. So this is going to be a difficulty in understanding Pollock. So this I will just say. So at the evidential Vyavaharika level, it is not going to be, whatever he writes is not important, whether it is true or false. But how it is perceived is much more important, and that it leads to practice of knowledge politics would be the 3 dimensions of Sheldon Pollock thought. And these motives will come, there are certain, this unseenness being seen, so that will come repeatedly in his text, and that will be connected to conflict, and that will lead to knowledge politics, and that will be supported with language. You see all his texts, starting with the Shastra text, this unseenness will be there. So I'll just go through it very fast. 1985, Shastra, but the idea of nature of Shastra in its own right has never been the object of sustained inquiry. So it's never been seen, it's not been seen, and leads to discourse of power. This is Ramayana and political imagination. He says, of course, they also raise questions that were larger and more puzzling, which is not been addressed, it is not being seen. More difficult means not being seen. what remains far less easy to figure. Again, it has not been really analyzed. And this is a history, however, that for pre-modern India at least remains largely unwritten. Again, it has not been seen. So that will come repeatedly here. Same thing, 2001 New Intellectuals, it remains as good as unwritten. It has not been seen and is going to tell us what it is. In the depth of the Sanskrit, we have the same thing. We have no clear understanding. And this is a complex question, which means it has not been addressed before, and again he's going to come and tell what it is. So there are several, this pattern, this kind of motives will occur repeatedly in many of his texts. So we'll just skip this. So we can form almost a general thesis statement, which we'll be seeing in all this almost text after 1995, starting with the Shastra text. So it will be something like this. It is remarkable or astonishing. This will be the language aspect, that a certain aspect, cultural aspect in the text has never been rarely noticed, complex, cause difficulties, which signifies the tension between cosmopolitan vernacular, Marga-Deshi, dominant local, which in turn has led us to understand knowledge politics and power structures in pre-modern India. So this will be general thesis statement for all his works, if you can. And this doesn't have to apply in doesn't have to occur in one state, just one sentence. This will either occur in one sentence, one paragraph, one in the introduction, in the abstract, or over the course of the paper. But all these motives will be seen. I tried to show about 5 motives in the paper. So this will be repeated. This is very this sort of makes it easy to understand also Pollock. If you understand these motives are being repeated, you can very easily it becomes very uncomplex also. I'll skip this also. One thing this about Vico, I wanted to say something. Indo-German connection. Okay, what is happening is this 1800 I said is very important. So 1800 is something very significant. What the early Germans are saying, something very significant has happened in 1800. That's what Nietzsche, at least as late as 1875, is saying. And that is followed by some great silence. There are not Western scholars who are talking about it. I think Rajuji gave the example of Whitehead also. Indian influence is not being said. And then if it is stated, if this influence is acknowledged, it is as if it is of not much consequence. So we have these 3 strands of thought. So Pollock comes in and says always, this 1800 is a very important date. So he says philology didn't start in 1800 because philology is the one that is going to be influencing all these subjects. Philology is essentially this Vyakarana and Nirukta and Mimamsa and Alankara Shastra put together, all these things. So that is what is going to be influencing all other branches. So beginning of philology is going to be very important. So whenever he talks about philology, he will say, okay, it is not started in 1800. It is started in 1737, he will say. These things are of course more complicated than this legend suggests. When we say more complicated, this is not being seen, so he's just pushing it back. So date is very important. He's going to be pushing it back to date. If we say 1737, then there is no Indian influence there as well. And then Vico's news, that is why Vico, I think I have to disagree with both of you. He goes back to Vico not because of this conceptual things, but he goes back to Vico because he wants to push the date back. Vico, he says, whenever he talks about philology, German philology, he says it has been anticipated by Vico, he says. So he'll push Vico's being referred to not for conceptual, maybe he's being inspired for Vico also, but it is more for pushing this date back to 1725, because Vico's New Science is composed in 1725. And if you take that as the beginning of modern philology, you can cut off this Indian influence. So that is, again, he may be influenced by Vico also, but I don't think that is the primary reason. And everywhere he's talking about parallel tradition, at least I think 6-7 places I saw. Parallel tradition, no question of any kind of influence, and simultaneous growth, he'll say. Parallel tradition, simultaneous growth. And some remarkable parallels will be there. And what is South Asia knowledge good for? He says, and there is, the dramatic silence is there. He says something and then he starts talking about this American university system. There is no connection is made here also. And this is where I bring in deep Orientalism. I think the purpose, essentially it is like a false kind of thing. As I said, at the Vyavaharika level, it's going to be, there will be a lot of facts also, but essentially the thesis is going to be false. But the purpose is actually to sort of, poison this Indian-German kind of connection. He's looking, as I said, there's going to be great silence, or there's going to be this kind of small acknowledgement, and he's going to go there and say, I'll just put some mines and just poison it forever. So people, whenever people think of this Indian influence, they only think of this Nazi, Sanskrit, Nazi, Sanskrit, Nazi, Nazi. So that is, I think, real purpose of this deep Orientalism. He wants to cut off this connection, this Indian influence that has been there in Europe. How do we respond to this? I think the Purva-Pakshan is there. Whatever you say, he's taken a position, all interpretations are correct. So they're not going to be convinced, number one. And if you keep on responding to this, they're going to be quite happy because this issue is kept in public. So what he doesn't want us to do, and we should also go beyond Pollock also, what he doesn't want us to do was, he doesn't want us to look into this connection. So what we should do, I think, a good response, but we have to respond to this, and we have, I think, 3 good papers that are going to come after lunch. We should go and actually seriously look at what is going on at this 1800, how Indian knowledge systems are being transferred, and what the major things that are going to change after that. So that, I think, that is a very good, that would be a very, that's what he doesn't want us to do, that's what perhaps we should do. And this is going beyond Pollock also. I think ultimately all said and done, Pollock is a very, I think, small figure in the greater scheme of things. And I didn't know this, so we should, I think, have a project, I think major project that sees all that. I think when I used to have my interactions with Dharampalji, he also suggested something to that extent, that we should have this kind of, how is Indian civilization interacting with not only the neighbors, also Africa and all other, the whole world as it is. So we should have a major project and that looks into all these different connections, because I think most of us don't know about this, and I didn't know about this all these years. Again, the importance of, I have some time, I hope.
You have another 5 minutes.
Okay.
But then questions will be fewer.
Okay. So importance of Pollock, I think one thing I did like about, a lot of negative things have been said, one thing I liked about Pollock is, I think, is sort of this global civilizational view he has. So they are starting a new project, I think, with this Benjamin Ellman of Princeton University, who's a sinologist. So there is a quote from that, indeed the vast set of differences, and the vast set of, indeed the vast set of differences and divergences that shape the development of these two radically antipodal re-emergent powers. He's talking about India and China. In one case, for example, a strong centralized state, in the other case a weak, even centrifugal one. In one case a positivist historiographical tradition, in other historiography almost indistinguishable from poetry, is the Indian tradition. In one case a literary tradition without any epics whatsoever, in other a tradition almost completely informed by the epic imagination. In one case a world shaped by printing, in the other an active rejection of printing, and now in one case of the builders of hardware, and in the other writers of software. Very nicely expressed also. So they have a big project which is essentially looking at the differences between these two things, and again the same thing, he says it's not been done before, and so we are going to start a project, and I don't know what he said in 2012, I don't know what happened to that project. But we should be thinking, when we think of Pollock, we should be thinking not only on this evidential Vyavaharika level, which it doesn't seem to be so important to him, how it is perceived is much more important. And ultimately that it leads to some kind of practice of knowledge politics that is going to be his highest goal. So that is Purva-Pakshan's, I think, mental psychology. So we should understand that, I think, and we should give our response also should be on a similar scale, I would say.
Excellent. Regarding the 1800, one of the important persons you should look at is Friedrich Schlegel, the brother of Augustus Schlegel. So, because he was the first German to get a PhD in Sanskrit, he went to France to get that, because it was available in England. It's a very ironic thing. The French had captured an English Sanskritist in a war in India, taken him as prisoner, Hamilton or whatever, one of those guys, I'm not sure of that. And so he started the Sanskrit studies in France, and so German had to go there. So Friedrich Schlegel has a very fascinating life, and he is the one who does so much work on Sanskrit, and he's totally in love with Sanskrit, and he is the one who proposes that they were our ancestors, that the Indians were their ancestors. This is before they twisted it around into the Aryan theory. The Aryan theory hadn't come about at that time. But Friedrich Schlegel, after doing so much work, he then has a U-turn. He marries the daughter of some very important Christian, and he gets a conversion and all that stuff, and then he starts hating India. He has it. But the first part of Friedrich Schlegel's life is very rich in knowledge being transferred in Germany. So you might want to take a look at that.
Right.
Second point is that this India-China project is a well-funded project, and you see the risk is that this relationship between our civilization and Chinese civilization, it ought to be done by our people, with the Chinese people, not two Americans sitting in Columbia and Princeton sorting it out and then telling us. Because the way it will be is that will be highly promoted, and these guys will be promoted all over these literary festivals and everywhere else, and then our people will be taught in JNU that this is who we are and how we relate to China, and then the Ministry of External Affairs will form Chinese policy based on that. This is the problem.
Two remarks on the state of philology. You know, you said that philology needs to be saved. You see, this is not a point where there is a conflict between the Western and the Indian view. You see, the developments are entirely parallel, probably because India is being governed by an anglicized class. Namely, as long as I've been in the field, I have only seen crisis and dwindling and, you know, professors retiring and not being replaced and so on. Pollock himself has very constructively, or very correctly at least, remarked that in India he can't find any specialists of Apabhransha and other classical languages anymore because nobody pays attention. Everybody goes to engineering college and so on. And so there's no funds, not from the government, not from anyone else for these things. And then about 18th century and so on. There is no real conflict between this highlighting of Vico and so on, the genesis of philology in the 18th, in fact even 17th century. It starts, as far as I'm concerned, with Spinoza's critique of the Bible, because that of course was uppermost in the minds of most Westerners at that time. And the input of India.
No, Pollock is saying that also, he's referring to Spinoza also. But what I'm saying is what the Germans are saying, what Nietzsche is saying.
Yes.
So Nietzsche seems to be saying something, Nietzsche is not saying, going back to Spinoza, Nietzsche is saying something significant has happened in 1800. That is what I'm just saying.
Okay, well, you see, but you mentioned...
Nietzsche is a very sharp person, right?
Right, but you mentioned Pollock downplaying the Indian impact on the genesis of philology. And about that I need to say this. You see, it is precisely because philology was fledgling, was taking off in Europe, that it was so sensitive. Once it was discovered what important discoveries India had made in this field. You see, and this is not necessary in history. Like, for instance, the Chinese in the Middle Ages had advanced very far in mathematics, you know, doing discoveries that Europeans would only do in the 19th or 20th century. Yet it didn't influence Europe because there was no contact. Whereas in this case, you know, there was contact and there was influence, and there was an incredible influence. I mean, the whole science of linguistics owes everything to Sanskrit, to the Sanskrit grammarians.
We don't know this. We don't care about it. It's not written. We don't.
Well, in that case, you see, the Pollocks of this world are blind in one eye because it's a very important development.
I think there's a confusion here. I think on this topic there's a confusion which needs to be clarified. The confusion is as follows, that it's not a question of where philology originated or what the date is. The question is that the kind of philology that traditional linguistics, see, philology is the precursor of linguistics. The discipline of linguistics comes out of philology, and philology became extremely important because of comparative philology of the kind that William Jones did, where he showed that Indic languages, Persian, Greek and Latin are all kins, they're all cousins.
Yeah.
And the invention, the idea of the Indo-European language family. So I think the confusion is as follows. Let me try to define it. This is conventional philology, which is linguistic, comparative, and then led to the understanding of morphology, phonology, phonetics, syntax. That's one direction. That is not the direction of Pollock. Pollock's is, as you rightly said, a political philology, which then leads to a liberating philology. Now, what is a political philology? For that, the precursor is Vico. In other words, and maybe Nietzsche in between. In other words, this is hermeneutics. It is a way to reinterpret texts, sometimes to unpack hidden meanings. This is what post-colonialists are doing. That is, they read texts and show you hidden meanings, and that produces an effect in the real world. Yesterday, Bhaiji was saying, what's the use of scholarship? It should lead to an impact in the real world. Now, this is what Pollock is telling you. Now, let me read you the end of, not you, because you studied it, but the rest of the audience. This sort of philology, a critical or reflexive or hermeneutic, or better, liberated philology, which also, when properly cultivated, promotes the cultivation of core political ethical values and becomes a sort of liberation philology. This is the great or grand plan. That is to say, liberation, by the way, liberation philology is a play on liberation theology. Liberation theology was used in Latin America on behalf of the oppressed. The church used the Bible to counter dictatorships. Now, Pollock wants to be this great white hero who will rescue the oppressed in India by using liberation philology. Against, that is using texts against themselves, classics against themselves, shastras against themselves, and free everybody. But to do that, you have to be liberated first. So the liberating philology that he proposes is the 73 interpretations, a kind of postmodern anekantavad, which he doesn't mention at all. But, so it is a liberated philology. It is not shastric, it is not bound, but it is liberated. Once it is liberated, it can be liberating to others. Now, you see, if you look at
one thing, there is a conceptual aspect and also verbal aspect. Now, I'm analyzing this from the verbal aspect. I can show you like 10 places where he'll say, okay, it's very complicated and he's going to do something else. And he says, this unseenness is there. That is what his own theory is. Something is unseen and he's going to be showing you something else. From the very verbal aspect, he's saying.
In other words, he's liberating the hidden meaning within the text in order to liberate the social.
No, that's about Vico. I'm talking about Vico, where this verbal aspect is there, using that verbal style, which is repeatedly done.
Precisely. That is what is meant by hermeneutics. You interpret the words, you interpret the sentences, you interpret the hidden meanings, what are called subtexts. Anyhow, the real point I'm trying to make is that there is no, there's no conflict here in our own interpretation. In other words, Pollock is not a conventional philologist who was a linguist or who is interested in linguistics. He's a political philologist. In other words, he wants to rehabilitate philology. In fact, hermeneutics, which he calls philology because philology was used on ancient texts, he's using it on Sanskrit and so-called classical Indian languages, which means not modern languages, but old Kannada, Hale Kannada, whatever. So, the point I'm trying to make is, in the Western academy, you become a hero if you give your discipline new things to do. And these are beleaguered disciplines, and you show their power in the real world. Now, what Pollock is trying to tell the world is, look, with this new political hermeneutics, I can ensure that somebody is not elected, I can prevent a civil war, I can intervene in a third world country, save its enslaved population. This is how powerful I'm making philology. And this is the Rakshas Jnana, which is, it's all about power in the Vyavaharika sense. And naturally, all our post-colonialists will flock to him because he's going to empower them, just as Nala went to study to get to know the Sanjeevani from the guru of the Asuras. So it's the same thing. So I'm saying that we have to look at this in a very broad fashion.
He's the big thing.
He's the great white horse. Let's understand.
Because
Isn't Pollock Jewish? Pollock is not Jewish, he's Scottish. There are two kinds of Pollocks.
That doesn't matter.
There are two kinds of Pollocks. One are the Polish guys who got called Pollocks who were Jews. But Pollock is a Scottish surname as well.
Yeah, but he's an atheist, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah, no, but he's Scottish, he's not even Jewish. Because
but
Wendy says she's a Hindu, but she's Jewish, and that's a different cup of tea.
The point I'm making is that when others to act
actually have read the stuff.
No, this is the first metacritical paper here.
It
First
actually-
one.
Actually, your
This is
paper,
the first paper.
Your paper should be not on the Ramayana only, but you're writing actually an evaluation of his philology. It's a methodological critique, which is very important.
So actually I didn't.
While he responded, he said, I am writing something to the first track was on Ramayana.
Yeah.
And then he probed deeper,
That is
and then
exactly,
he said, I changed
that
topic.
is exactly right. Any place of Pollock, when you start the box, will be fine. When you go deeper, you will actually uncover all kinds of things. And that's what you've done.
Professor,
Very good.
Professor Kannan, just a corrective suggestion in this slide that this philology,
Very
even
good.
in 1984 paper, he's using this construct, but he's not mentioning philology. But if you read the introduction of that paper, then he's mentioning higher criticism, higher narrative, subtextual matters, which is embedded not in text but in higher narrative. So he's essentially. So you should consider reading 1984 paper and make that as maybe the strategically starting point of philology.
No, I have to admit I was doing fair job.
Shah wants to speak.
I think Professor Palanpe has covered what I want to say. I was referring to 1800 is very important from now, that is telling. So 1784,
William Jones.
you go delivered the first lecture in the Asiatic Society of Calcutta, founded. And then he introduces Sanskrit to the world with an imagination that these people must be living at one time, otherwise why there is so much closeness. So, and that is a basis for development of a discipline, a new discipline called comparative philology in the Indo-European linguistics.
He said
That is
Sanskrit is more perfect than Greek,
Greek, yeah.
more
Copious than Latin.
copious than
And
Latin,
all that is it.
more explicit
And
than
that
Isaac.
inspires the Westerners to jump, to learn more and more Sanskrit and start comparing their own stuff. And then out of this exercise, a new discipline called comparative philology and historical linguistics, Indo-European linguistics, such disciplines emerge. So I think that may be the reason.
That's a very good one. Jones didn't live long enough.
Yeah,
Died
yeah.
very early.
But he gave an imagination.
He actually started to open the
Look,
books.
yeah, yeah.
But Friedrich Schlegel took it very far.
Schlegel said Sanskrit is the mother of all languages.
Friedrich was Schlegel, unlike Jones was working for the East India Company. So his idea was how to rule them better, understand them. But Schlegel was actually of the view that the Indians are our ancestors. And the opposite of the Aryan invasion, which came later with Max Muller inverting it.
Actually, I have to say some of this was not. It was very short time. A lot of reading was there. Some of this was based on intuition. I didn't want to present it, but then, Pollock said all interpretations are correct. So it
Can I have just half a minute? Excuse me, can I have just half a minute? Actually, just before this, both of us were wanting to ask a question, which are more broad. That besides studying his methodology of attacking the content, we need to study Pollock's methodology of how he has his papers have gained importance, his message has gained importance, and what is it that we are not doing, or what is it that we are lacking, that what we want to say is not gaining that importance. And I think what you have presented now, and beautifully summarized by Dr. Paranjpe, as to his way of how he positions the study and why is he doing this work and what can be the outcome of this work, that is what helps place these kind of works in public, public acceptance and gains more, gives them more popularity. And this is perhaps something that we have to take a lesson from. And like he suggested, why can't Indians and Chinese themselves do? So we have to set up things which can bring out the relevance in modern context, bring out these kind of hidden and unhidden meanings and present them for modern context to make our voice more popular as well.
On that, I want to say, if you look at his own journey, there's a break point. He is patronized by Mr. Clay, who's an investment banker. Okay, until the financial crisis, the subprime financial crisis, Clay goes broke. A few years later, he dies. So his clay library job is over. He goes looking for another sponsor. And just like in his theory of Sanskrit, he says that the Sanskrit traveled overseas because their Indian sponsors had disruption and could not continue. So they went to Cambodia and all these South Asian countries. So in the same way, his subprime market crash, the sponsor skill, or in the financial sense. So he went overseas to India to look for a new sponsor. And he found Murthy's. Now I'm telling you this, his shift to India was dramatic. He suddenly now become praising India, going to Shingeri here and there, doing all this drama with this dhoti and all that stuff he's doing. He now that was not the early Pollock. The early Pollock was very much, his audience was the Americans. He was becoming the new theorist of world culture, world this, world that. His knowledge of Sanskrit he was bringing as, hey, I'm the only person around the table, you know Chinese, you know Arabic, you know this, I know Sanskrit, and Sanskrit is so great and blah, 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 and I can figure out its problems, I can intervene, I'm kind of the master of that. So he was actually a player within the American Academy. But this huge grant and huge patronage, and about the same time, they started promoting him every year in the literary festivals in India. So if you want to know what made him successful, it's a very brilliant play on these things, on the Indian psychology. He knew how to get the money. Somebody got him the Padam Shri. So that is all important to understand if you really want to locate his history. That there is a shift after he moves from clay library. Big shift in his politics and his thinking.
And then he goes against all this BJP and all.
So evidently I have abstained from saying anything, but with the permission of the chair, I'll take 20 seconds alone, and literally 20 seconds. 1800 actually figures on MCLI website as well. It is defined as the end point of what is considered classical about Indian literature. And it's very interesting what you bring up as a point of departure over here as well as 1800s. There is actually a lot going on around that period. And we need to really dig and understand it. It's there on the website. Anyone can access and you can see it's defined as a clean end point, and some fairly vague definition about the British impact on India is cited as that end point. Why should we take that as the end point? Sorry for that.
On the Sense Philology paper by Narendran, as Professor Paranjpe correctly pointed out, it's probably the first meta-criticism we have seen, and I was very impressed by the 5 motives that you have brought up, the 5 motives which repeatedly occur in Pollock's writings, and it would be good to expand this to other writings and see how prominent they are in other writings. I think no culture has a complete understanding of itself. All interpretations are true, debatable, but I would like to see, in terms of philology, is there something we can do in terms of comparing, or rather outlining the differences and similarities between something similar in the Indian tradition, something like Tatparya Nirnay and the tools for reaching Tatparya Nirnay. So you have Upkramaopasamhara, Abhyasa, Apurvata, Phalam, Arthavada and Upapatti. I mean, we have a tradition of interpreting texts, and the Mimamsakas did bring up a very formalized framework to interpret the essence of a text. And you have, the Mahabharata Tatparya Nirnay or Gita Tatparya Nirnay works by Madhvacharya. You have similar other works. Now there would be differences, there would be similarities, but we did have something of this sort of making sense of texts. And what my personal opinion is, what we need to do to counter somebody like somebody like Pollock or somebody like Doniger is not only to strengthen our own traditional way of interpreting text, but also defeating them at their own turf, which is to master their own tools and defeat them at their own game. So it's like the Britishers taught us cricket, but today we beat them. So they taught the Sri Lankans cricket, and Sri Lankans beat them. So we need to beat them at their own game, and that's why it's very important, as Mr. Narendran pointed out, to understand the themes, the repeated themes in Pollock's writings, and see how we can respond to them.
I guess that's all I had to say. Thank you very much. It was a wonderful